The little girl's voice was soft, almost shy. "Grandpa, what does AFFA mean?" The old man froze. His coffee cup stopped halfway, that question. It opened a door he'd kept shut for decades. By week's end, she would stand beside him at a funeral, surrounded by 300 roaring riders. Before we start this story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Also, please subscribe to the channel. It will help us to bring you more inspiring stories every day. Autumn light spilled across the porch of a small house in Ashwood Valley. 8-year-old Sophie Williams sat cross-legged with crayons, filling her notebook with flowers and strange letters copied from her grandfather's vest. Across the back of the leather was a patch that carried weight, even if she didn't yet know it. Her grandpa, Henry Hank Williams, 72, rocked in his chair, staring past the hills. His hands, scarred and calloused, gripped a chipped mug. Sophie looked up. "Grandpa, what's A.F.F.A?" she asked, tracing the letters carefully. Hank's jaw tensed. For years, no one in the family dared ask. To Sophie, it was just curiosity. But for Hank, it was memory, brotherhood, blood, and ghosts. He looked at her, eyes clouded with something deeper than time. "Always, forever, forever, always," he whispered. The girl tilted her head. "But what does it mean?" Silence fell heavy. Hank looked away toward the horizon, where the road disappeared into pine. He knew the answer couldn't be told. It had to be shown. That evening, after Sophie was tucked into bed, Hank sat alone in his kitchen. The ticking clock echoed like footsteps from another life. On the table lay a faded photograph. 10 men in leather smiling, engines rumbling behind them. In the center, a young Hank grinned, wild-eyed, a world away from the man he had become. He traced the edges of the photo, pausing on one face, Earl Red Dog Jensen. Hank's oldest friend, his brother in every way but blood, the man whose funeral was set for Saturday. The news of Earl's passing had shaken something loose. For years, Hank had hidden that part of himself from his family, afraid they'd never understand. To them, he was just Grandpa Hank, the quiet man who grew tomatoes and read Sophie bedtime stories. But Sophie's question burned. If she wanted to know what AFFA meant, maybe it was time she saw. Not in words, in thunder, in chrome, in the farewell of a brother who never rode alone. The next morning, Sophie spotted Hank loading his old truck, a pressed shirt, polished boots, and the leather vest he hadn't worn in years. The patches looked alive again. Sophie frowned. "Where are you going, Grandpa?" He hesitated, then smiled. "You're coming with me, kiddo. A friend's goodbye." She climbed in beside him, hugging her stuffed bear tight. The road wound through rolling hills, each mile dragging memories out of Hank's silence. Sophie hummed softly, watching trees blur, unaware of the weight beside her. At a stoplight, another truck pulled up, its driver nodding at Hank. On his dashboard lay a folded bandana with the same AFFA letters. Sophie noticed. "Does everyone know that word?" she asked. Hank cleared his throat. "Some words aren't just words. They're promises." She leaned closer. "Like a secret?" "Not a secret," he said gently. "A bond." As the light turned green, Hank pressed the gas, the old engine groaning. The closer they drew to the town's edge, the more engines began to echo in the distance. By mid-morning, Sophie's eyes widened at the sight of them. Motorcycles lined the roadside like steel horses, chrome shining in the autumn sun. Men and women in leather stood tall, patches on their backs carrying stories she couldn't yet read. The air trembled with the low growl of Harleys idling. Sophie clutched Hank's hand tighter. "Grandpa, who are they?" Hank inhaled, shoulders heavy. "Family," he said simply. As they stepped forward, riders turned. Rough faces broke into smiles. Some hugged Hank, others gripped his shoulders with respect. "Brother," they called him, voices deep with recognition. Sophie felt small among them, but no one ignored her. A tall woman knelt to her level, handing her a single white rose. "For Earl," she whispered. Sophie held the flower close, her chest rising with a mix of fear and awe. She glanced at her grandpa. For the first time, she saw him not as just the man who made pancakes on Sundays, but as someone bigger, someone known. And then the rumble began to rise, engines roared alive, shaking the ground beneath Sophie's shoes. The line of riders stretched farther than she could see. Black leather and chrome shimmered under the sun, the patches on their backs forming a river of unity. Hank lifted Sophie into the truck bed so she could see. Her eyes sparkled as 300 motorcycles rolled into formation, each one thunder layered on thunder. The noise was deafening, but somehow it felt holy. "Grandpa, are they all here for your friend?" she shouted over the roar. Hank nodded, voice breaking. "Every last one." Sophie looked at the rose in her hand, then at the ocean of riders. "They must have really loved him." Hank swallowed hard, gripping the side of the truck. "We all did. Earl was the kind of man you never ride away from." The procession began to move, slow and steady, heading toward the church on the hill. Sophie's heart pounded. She didn't fully understand it yet, but she knew she was part of something bigger than herself. The church stood at the edge of Maple Ridge, its old stone walls framed by golden leaves. As the riders parked one by one, the street outside filled with chrome, leather, and silence that carried weight. Sophie had never seen so many tough-looking people so quiet. Inside, the pews creaked under the weight of patched vests. The air smelled of motor oil, leather, and lilies. Sophie held Hank's hand tightly, clutching her rose. At the front rested a coffin draped in black, a weathered helmet placed carefully on top. Hank's throat tightened at the sight. Earl's helmet. He remembered the day Earl bought it, the scratches from rides they swore would never end. Memories surged like an old song too heavy to sing. Sophie whispered, "Grandpa, was he your best friend?" Hank nodded, his eyes wet. "My brother." When the organ began to play, Sophie squeezed his hand again, sensing that this was no ordinary farewell. It was the closing of a road that had carried generations. The pastor spoke softly, words about loyalty and friendship echoing through the vaulted ceiling. But it wasn't scripture that filled the room. It was the presence of the riders, each silent, their bowed heads forming a sea of respect. Hank shifted uneasily, his mind drifting. He remembered nights on open highways, Earl's laughter cutting through the wind. He remembered the scars they carried, both visible and hidden. Most of all, he remembered promises. Promises sealed with A.F.F.A. Sophie leaned close. "Grandpa, why are they all wearing the same jackets?" Hank looked down at her, the question cutting through years of silence. He whispered, "Because they never wanted to lose each other." Sophie thought about school, about how friends drifted away. She clutched her rose tighter, realizing this was different. These people stayed. As the pastor's words ended, a deep rumble began again outside. Engines, hundreds of them, all starting at once. The sound rolled through the walls like thunder. Sophie's eyes widened. "What's happening?" Hank exhaled. The final ride. They stepped out into sunlight that was already dimming with grey clouds. Riders mounted their bikes in unison, chrome flashing like a river of steel. The coffin was carried out carefully, draped in the black flag of their brotherhood. Sophie watched in awe as Hank joined the men at the front, his old boots steady on the church steps. For a moment he looked 20 years younger, the weight of grief sharpening into pride. The lead rider raised 2 fingers. Engines revved in response, a roar that echoed across Maple Ridge. The coffin was placed into a hearse with reverence, and the formation began to roll. Sophie sat in the truck again, watching as row after row followed, headlights glowing like a solemn parade. People lined the sidewalks, shopkeepers, mothers, even children, standing still as the riders passed. She leaned close to her grandpa. "Do they do this for everyone?" Hank's eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. "No, Sophie. Only for a brother." The procession stretched for miles. Every street corner, every hill, carried the vibration of engines that seemed endless. Sophie pressed her face to the window, counting the riders until she lost track. A woman standing on a porch wiped her eyes as the convoy passed. A police cruiser blocked intersections, its officer standing at attention, hand over heart. Sophie had never seen strangers honor someone they didn't know. Hank drove steady, his gaze hard but misty. He remembered Earl's words. "One day, brother, I'll ride that last highway. Just don't let me go alone." Now, watching hundreds fulfill that vow, Hank's chest ached with something between sorrow and gratitude. Sophie tugged his sleeve. "Grandpa, does AFFA mean you'll never be alone?" He swallowed hard. "Yes, sweetheart. Always, forever. Forever, always. It means no matter what road you're on, someone rides with you." She rested her head on his arm, listening to the thunder roll, her young heart beginning to understand. At the cemetery gates, rows of motorcycles lined the perimeter like sentinels. Riders dismounted, removing their helmets in silent unison. Sophie gripped her rose, following Hank as they approached the open ground where the coffin waited. The air smelled of damp earth and exhaust. A line of men lifted their vests, showing patches faded by years, as if to say, "He still rides with us." Sophie saw faces carved with grief, but no tears, only strength. Hank walked forward, his steps heavy. He placed his hand on the coffin, whispering something no one else could hear. Then he motioned Sophie closer. Her little hands trembled as she placed the rose gently on the wood. For a moment the whole crowd seemed to pause. A child's gesture among warriors. A rider with a white beard touched her shoulder. "He'd be proud you came, little one." Sophie smiled shyly. For the first time she felt like she belonged here, not just as a visitor, but as part of Grandpa's world. The funeral rites began. A bell tolled softly, its sound swallowed by the weight of silence. Each rider stepped forward in turn, laying down tokens, a bandana, a lighter, a photograph, onto Earl's resting place. When it was Hank's turn, his hands shook. From his pocket, he pulled out a rusty keychain shaped like a winged wheel. Earl had given it to him on the day they first called themselves brothers. Hank pressed it to the coffin, whispering, "Ride free, Red Dog." Sophie's eyes filled with tears, though she didn't know why. She just felt the ache in her grandpa's voice. She slipped her small hand into his, grounding him in that moment. As the coffin was lowered, riders formed a circle, engines idling low like a heartbeat. The sound rose and fell as if the earth itself was breathing with them. Sophie whispered, "Grandpa, is this goodbye?" Hank looked down at her with a sad smile. "Goodbye isn't the end, Sophie. It's just another ride." The engines cut at once. Silence fell so complete it pressed against the ears. For a long moment no one moved. Then a single rider raised his hand. The rest followed, fists in the air. A salute that carried more than words ever could. Sophie clutched her bear against her chest. She had never felt such stillness, yet such power. Even as a child, she knew this wasn't just about Earl. It was about all of them, standing together as proof that promises could outlive men. Hank exhaled slowly, his body trembling. He had dreaded this day, feared the flood of memory. But now, with Sophie by his side, he felt something else rising. Peace. As the riders began to disperse, Sophie tugged his sleeve. "Grandpa, will they do this for you one day?" He knelt to her level, his weathered face soft. "If they do, just remember, what matters isn't how many come, but whether you live true to your road." On the drive home, the sky broke open with rain. Drops streaked the windshield, blurring the fading procession in the rearview mirror. Sophie sat quietly, watching water chase itself across the glass. She finally asked, "Grandpa, why didn't you ever tell us about this before?" Hank gripped the wheel, his knuckles pale. "Because some roads are hard to explain." "I didn't want you to think less of me," Sophie frowned. "Why would I?" He hesitated. Memories of fights, mistakes, scars, all the parts of that life that weren't shiny chrome or easy laughter. Because sometimes brotherhood comes with mistakes. With hurt. She reached across the seat, placing her small hand on his. "But you loved them. And they loved you." Hank blinked back tears, his chest tight. From the mouth of a child, truth had landed softly. He nodded, voice rough. "Yes, Sophie. That's what mattered most." Outside, thunder rolled again, not from the sky, but from distant engines still echoing. The rain eased as they pulled back into Ashwood Valley. Familiar streets welcomed them home. Quiet houses, kids on bikes, a corner diner glowing in neon. Yet something felt different. As if Sophie now saw the town through her grandpa's eyes, she turned in her seat. "Grandpa, does A.F.F.A mean they're your family even if they're not blood?" Hank smiled faintly. "That's exactly what it means. Always forever, forever always. No matter the storm, no matter the years." Sophie tucked the letters away in her heart. She pictured her school friends, wondering if any bond could last that long. At the house, Hank hung his vest carefully by the door. Sophie touched the leather, her small fingers brushing over the patches. "Can I draw this in my notebook?" she asked. Hank chuckled softly. "Of course, sweetheart. Maybe one day you'll understand every patch has a story." And for the first time, Hank didn't feel the need to hide that story anymore. That night, Sophie sat at the kitchen table, crayons spread out like confetti. She carefully drew her grandpa's vest, each patch copied with the concentration only children carry. When she finished, she looked up. "Grandpa, do you think Mr. Earl can see us from heaven?" Hank, washing dishes at the sink, paused. His reflection in the window looked younger somehow, softened by her innocence. He turned, drying his hands. "If there's a road up there, Sophie, I know he's riding it. And if he saw today, he'd smile knowing you were part of it." Sophie placed her drawing in front of him. At the top, in big colorful letters, she'd written, A.F.F.A. Hank's throat closed. He picked her up, hugging her tightly. For years the letters had been heavy. Now in her handwriting they felt lighter. He whispered, "Thank you, kiddo. You gave me something today I didn't know I needed." Over the next days, Sophie couldn't stop talking about the riders. At school she told her teacher about 300 motorcycles and how they all came for one man. Her classmates gasped, some skeptical, but Sophie's eyes shone with certainty. At home she asked Hank endless questions. "Did you and Mr. Earl ever get lost? Did you ride at night? Did the wind hurt your face?" Hank laughed for the first time in weeks. Yes, and sometimes. The house that once felt quiet now buzzed with her curiosity. Hank found himself telling stories he had buried, of campfires under desert skies, of helping strangers on the road, of laughter shared in diners at 2 a.m. Each tale brought Sophie closer to understanding. Each memory brought Hank closer to forgiving himself. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun sink, Sophie said softly, "Grandpa, I think A.F.F.A means love." Hank's eyes misted. That's the truest answer yet. The following weekend, riders returned, not 300 but a handful. They rolled up Hank's driveway, engines humming like a familiar hymn. Sophie dashed out to greet them, her bear tucked under her arm. "Hey, little one rider grinned, kneeling to her height. "You must be Hank's granddaughter. Heard you were braver than most of us last week." Sophie beamed. "I gave Mr. Earl a flower." The rider's eyes softened. He would have liked that. Inside, Hank shared coffee with his brothers, laughter mixing with sorrow. Sophie perched nearby, listening as stories spilled. Of Earl's stubborn kindness, of near misses on the highway, of times they swore they'd never make it home, but always did. For Sophie, it was like opening a book of legends. For Hank, it was like reclaiming a part of himself he thought was gone. As the riders left, one handed Sophie a tiny patch. "Keep this safe," he said. "It means your family, too." Sophie carried that patch everywhere, in her pocket at school, under her pillow at night. She didn't fully understand its weight, but she knew it meant belonging. One evening she asked Hank, "When you're gone, will I still be family to them?" The question stopped him cold. He knelt beside her. "Sophie, family doesn't end when someone leaves. It carries on. That's what A.F.F.A is about. We don't let go." "Not ever." She nodded slowly, pressing the patch to her chest. Hank studied her, realizing something. He had once feared his past would be a burden on her. Instead, it had given her strength. She didn't see scars. She saw loyalty, love, and courage. That night Hank dreamed of Earl again, but instead of sorrow he felt peace. Earl laughed in the dream, engines roaring, the road endless, and Hank woke with a smile, knowing Sophie had turned loss into something living. Weeks later, Sophie surprised Hank with a school project. She stood proudly at the living room table, holding a poster covered in drawings of motorcycles and the letters AFFA. At the top, she'd written, "Family is forever." Her teacher had asked what family meant. Sophie had chosen this. Hank's eyes filled as he traced her drawings. "You did this all by yourself?" Sophie nodded. "I told everyone it doesn't matter if you're blood or not. If you ride together, if you love each other, that's family." Hank pulled her close, pride swelling in his chest. For years he had hidden that truth out of fear. Now hearing it spoken through a child's voice, he knew Earl's legacy and his own would not fade. That night, as stars scattered across the sky, Hank whispered a prayer of thanks. Not for the miles behind him, but for the granddaughter who carried his road forward in her heart. Months later, on a bright spring morning, Hank and Sophie sat once again on the porch. Birds sang, the road stretched quiet, and Sophie leaned against him, patch sewn carefully into her backpack. "Grandpa," she asked softly, "will you teach me to ride someday?" Hank chuckled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "When you're old enough, we'll take it slow. First you learn balance, then you learn respect for the road," Sophie grinned. "And AFFA?" he smiled. "AFFA isn't something you learn. It's something you live." As the wind stirred the trees, Hank closed his eyes. For the first time in years he felt complete, not weighed by what he had lost, but lifted by what remained. Engines echoed faintly on the horizon, distant but steady. Sophie perked up. "Do you hear that?" Hank nodded. "Yeah, kiddo. That's the sound of family." And together they sat in silence, the road stretching out before them, forever always. If this story touched your heart, don't let it ride alone. Like this video, subscribe to our channel and tap the bell icon, so you never miss another journey of love, loyalty, and brotherhood. And tell us in the comments, what does family mean to you?